Good afternoon. I am Emma Dench, Dean of the Harvard Kenneth C. Griffin Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, and I am delighted to welcome you all to Harvard Horizons 2025. Each year, Harvard Griffin GSAS selects a group of PhD students from scores of applicants to become Harvard Horizons scholars. They receive in-depth, personalized mentoring from the program's faculty fellows and coaching designed to enhance the skills they need to describe their research to funding bodies, hiring committees, interviewers, and us. Most difficult of all, the general public. For over a decade, Harvard Horizons has helped our scholars develop the skills to communicate their research in language that all of us can understand, no matter what our discipline. And as you will see, they make it look easy. But do not be fooled. Let's not underestimate the importance of the training they've received from the Derek Box Center for Teaching and Learning. And I'd like to ask my wonderful colleague and friend, Professor Karen Thornber, Richard L. Menschel, Faculty Director of the Derek Box Center for Teaching and Learning, to help us peek behind the curtain. Thank you, Karen.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Dean Dench, for that very warm welcome. It's a true pleasure to be here tonight. Although I've had the honor of being a faculty fellow for Horizons since its inception, this moment feels especially meaningful, since it marks my first Horizon as the Richard L. Menschel Faculty Director of the Derek Box Center for Teaching and Learning. I'm excited to lead our team in supporting the Horizons scholars as they share their groundbreaking research with you all tonight. Harvard Horizons exemplifies the Box Center's commitment to working with GSAS and the broader FAS and university community. We are committed to partnering with units on and off campus in developing programs for faculty and students alike that promote civil dialogue and the communicating and sharing of diverse perspectives. In particular, Box staff have been working together and one-on-one with the Horizons scholars since January to help them develop the professional skills needed to make accessible to broad and diverse audiences inside and outside the classroom their significant research contributions. It is crucial that both faculty and students are able to communicate and connect with the broader world. Through this long-term effort between the Harvard Kenneth C. Griffin's Graduate School of Arts and Sciences and Harvard's Derek Box Center for Teaching and Learning, Horizons scholars learn to craft compelling narratives, enhance their vocal and physical presence, and communicate complex ideas both orally and visually. These multimodal skills are foundational, both for engaging students in the classroom and for ensuring that research, which has the potential to contribute significantly to the well-being of all, is both accessible and impactful to a wider audience. Tonight's GSAS and Box Center event celebrates the achievements of these 8 brilliant scholars. In addition, it reflects the Box Center's broader commitment to supporting the entire academic community, graduate students, faculty, postdocs, and undergraduates, in developing expertise necessary to share their research with the world. This work is central to the Box Center's goal of fostering a culture of connection. The research you'll hear tonight spans a range of critical issues, from artificial intelligence to the resilience of democratic institutions, topics that are central to national and global conversations. The training these scholars receive from the Bach Center and from their GSAS faculty mentors through the Harvard Horizons program not only prepares them for tonight's symposium, but also equips them with the skills to communicate their work effectively in teaching, public talks, and beyond, ensuring that they can connect with and engage diverse audiences in meaningful ways. And now I'm delighted to pass the stage back to my dear friend and colleague, Emma Dench, Dean Dench, who will introduce this evening's Horizons Scholars.
Thank you so much, Karen. And now, this feels a little bit like the Oscar moment. Join me in welcoming to the stage this year's Harvard Horizons Scholars. So we have, from nearest to me, Catherine Horgan, McKinley Fitzpatrick, Raphael Rowe, Catherine Venturo Connolly, Brandon Campbell, Alex Braslavsky, Sergio Alarcon Robledo, and Andrew O'Donoghue. So, without further ado, let the 2025 Harvard Horizons presentations begin.
One night in Istanbul in 2016, while I was working for the US State Department, I watched, first in confusion, then in panic, as tanks blockaded a nearby bridge. A faction of Turkey's military was staging a coup attempt. When the elected government prevailed over the coup plotters, I saw citizens celebrating the triumph of democracy. At the same time, I saw thousands of people arrested as the president used emergency powers to purge the judiciary and imprison opponents. I realized I couldn't understand the powerful forces threatening democracy, nor did I know what I could do to protect democracy. I came to Harvard because I had this problem I needed to solve. The global challenge facing democracy has motivated my research as a political scientist and inspired me to ask the following question: why do courts defend or undermine democracy, in particular by upholding legal constraints on powerful political leaders? Now, democracy literally means the rule of the people. We choose our leaders and hold them accountable through elections. But for the democratic process to be free and fair, we also need the rule of law. Our conventional wisdom is that the courts should act as defenders of democracy. Alexander Hamilton, a key architect of the US Constitution, wrote that the judiciary is an excellent barrier to the encroachments and oppressions of elected leaders. But sometimes, courts act instead as agents of democratic erosion, as political weapons that advance the interests of one partisan camp rather than democracy. To understand why courts defend or undermine democracy, my research compares two critical cases of democratic backsliding: Turkey under President Tayyip Erdogan and Israel under Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. In Turkey, Erdogan not only captured the courts, he also mobilized societal support to do so. In Israel, Netanyahu tried to curb the courts, but faced historic societal opposition and was forced to suspend several key proposals. To understand these divergent outcomes for democracy, I went inside Turkey and Israel's highest courts. In both countries, I conducted dozens of interviews with high-ranking judges, lawyers, and experts. I also collected original data on thousands of decisions in which the courts evaluated whether government policies were unconstitutional. These sources of data, in combination, offer us unique insights. High-ranking judges have a front-row seat to democratic backsliding, but they're very difficult to access and to interview. Let me tell you the story of what I discovered. To understand why courts constrain powerful leaders, you need to look at three key factors. The first factor is what I call judicial power sharing. In other words, whether the process of appointing judges requires cross-partisan compromise. The second factor is the power of the political establishment, the degree to which elites and political parties and state institutions can block an attack on the courts. The final factor is societal mobilization, whether citizens mobilize for or against the courts. To develop this theory, I traveled first to Turkey. The key lesson I learned there is this: when courts become captured by one partisan camp, they often become agents of democratic erosion. In Turkey, the process of appointing judges required very low levels of power sharing. Turkey's president handpicked judges for the Constitutional Court without even consulting elected officials, let alone ensuring consensus. The result? Turkey's president almost always won in court. In my analysis of court decisions, like these ones, I find that when Turkey's president asked the Constitutional Court to strike down government policies, the president won almost 80% of the time. When a religious conservative leader named Tayyip Erdogan rose to power in 2003, he initially faced powerful constraints from Turkey's political establishment. Those constraints forced Erdogan to work gradually and covertly. To undermine the judiciary, Erdogan used a strategy I call court baiting. He passed very popular policies, like allowing Muslim women to wear headscarves in universities, a policy that 75% of the public supported, but that Turkey's secular courts struck down. In response, Erdogan argued, persuasively, that the judiciary was obstructing the will of the people, milli irade in Turkish. Erdogan mobilized broad societal support, even outside his own voter base, for increasing government's control over the courts in a constitutional referendum in 2010. That is how Erdogan, in the name of democracy, crushed the courts. To understand why courts defend democracy, I needed to travel elsewhere, to Israel. Actually, I was in Tel Aviv last week, but I flew back just for you guys. In Israel, I spoke to people with wide-ranging perspectives, from a liberal Supreme Court president to a conservative justice minister, from people who are ultra-Orthodox to Palestinian. These people disagree about what democracy means and whether Israel is democratic. In Israel, Prime Minister Netanyahu has been in power for more than 16 years. That's half my lifetime. Yet surprisingly, Israel's Supreme Court continues to act as a constraint on executive power. Why? The first factor is judicial power sharing. As one Israeli Supreme Court clerk told me, on the Judicial Selection Committee, politicians do not have unlimited power to appoint their preferred judge. They have to compromise. As a result, Israel followed what I call the Noah's Ark strategy. The opposing sides couldn't agree on one judge, so they appointed judges 2 by 2, one from each side, or even 4 by 4. This judicial power sharing allowed elected governments to influence the Supreme Court, but not to capture it entirely. But then, in 2022, Netanyahu formed a more extreme coalition in which establishment actors lost power to block an attack on the courts. As a result, Netanyahu's government suddenly and overtly challenged the courts. That sudden attack backfired. Even though elected officials couldn't protect the judiciary, this sudden attack created a focal point for societal mobilization to defend the courts. Numerous sectors of Israeli society, from tech leaders and trade unions to military reservists, mobilized to sustain large-scale, long-term protests. This societal mobilization pressured Israel's government to withdraw several proposals, although the fight over Israel's courts continues to this day. Of course, challenges to the courts are not unique to Israel or to Turkey. Today, in democracies around the world, political leaders are challenging legal constraints on their power, from Poland in 2016 to Brazil in 2020, Mexico in 2024, and of course, the United States today. What can the United States learn from other democracies that have faced this global challenge? Let's start with the first factor, judicial power sharing. I find that 3 institutions tend to promote judicial power sharing: a supermajority requirement to appoint new judges, compromise between elected and non-elected actors, and age or term limits. Israel had all 3 of these power-sharing institutions, whereas Turkey had just 1. What about the United States? When we score democracies around the world by their level of judicial power sharing, the United States ranks last. Ever since the Senate eliminated the supermajority requirement for Supreme Court justices in 2017, the United States has none of the 3 institutions that protect the courts from partisan politics. The second factor is the power of the political establishment. In the United States today, the president faces very few constraints from establishment political elites. That lack of constraints is enabling an unusually aggressive attack on the courts. So what about societal mobilization? If a political leader sought to curb the courts, would citizens in the United States defend them? Other countries have shown us divergent paths for our democracy. Which path we take is up to us.
It may seem like as archaeologists excavate, we uncover the past. But what I see coming out of the ground is way messier than any history book that you have ever read. What you see on the screen is the site of North Saqqara in Egypt, which was the main elite cemetery of Memphis, close to modern Cairo, at the time of state formation. That is roughly 3000 to 2600 BCE. This site was subject of intensive excavations in the 20th century that uncovered hundreds of tombs, way more tombs than any archaeologist could possibly analyze in a lifetime. And archaeologists had to choose. They chose the best preserved, the largest ones, or the structures that served their own questions. Based on these structures, archaeologists built historical narratives, hoping to understand how and why ancient Egyptian civilization developed to shape some of the most monumental buildings ever known, like the famous Giza pyramids. In constructing these narratives, archaeologists understood the construction process as the means to obtain an end product that was ready to be used. And it is this end product that they compared to the end products of other structures, and then putting them in a historical narrative. History is not uncovered, it is written. And my job as an archaeologist is to challenge these narratives and test them against new evidence. In my dissertation, I have studied the tombs of North Saqqara in detail, and I have realized that the reality is a little bit more complicated. These tombs were built for a purpose, and they were used for rituals, yes. But they were later transformed as new needs arose for other rituals, like the funerals. And yet, they were further transformed to provide space for what we call post-mortem cult. But even this scheme of successive phases of construction and use is an oversimplification. Buildings are like people, and writing about their history is very much like writing their biography. In our lives, there may be many moments which are representative of our identities, like, for example, my graduation, hopefully coming in a few weeks. But even freezing one moment of every day of our lives would not be representative of what living looks like. We live our lives in a much more fluid and dynamic way. And that is precisely how I like to think about buildings, as fluid entities that change constantly. Specifically, I'm interested in understanding how the lives of buildings and the lives of people intertwine and shape each other. This is no easy task, or at least not for North Saqqara, because it has been a long time since these buildings were built and used and transformed and used again and eventually abandoned. In 1930, a British archaeologist arrived to North Saqqara and started excavating the outline of these structures. He unfortunately passed away too soon and could not publish much of his work. And another archaeologist came in a few years later. His name was Walter Bryan Emery. Emery undertook much more systematic excavations of the site and discovered those hundreds of tombs that I was talking about earlier. But archaeology does not happen in a vacuum, and his work was interrupted by the outbreak of World War II, and then he had problems finding a job. And long story short, he could not pay the attention that he would have liked to these tombs, and many of them remained unpublished and unknown to the scientific community. And actually, the plan of the site is still unknown. We don't know where it is, it's lost. And here is where I came. I arrived to North Saqqara in 2023, and I realized that Emery never backfilled the tombs that he excavated. Actually, the tombs had only been covered by windblown sand. This means that the topography of the site reflects the structures that lie underneath. I placed a camera on top of a pole and walked the landscape, taking thousands of photographs, which I then used to create three-dimensional models of the landscape as it looks today. This was done through a technique called digital photogrammetry. These models allowed me to find traces of those structures, which I then compared with the documents of Emery, and I found matches. This has been a long process, but it has allowed me to find the location of many of those tombs that had been lost for so many years. And actually, I have been able to reconstruct a large portion of that lost plan of the site. Using this data, I am building renderings of how these structures would have looked like in the past, which allow me to wonder about how the people who walked the landscape in the past would have perceived it. What did they see? What did they hear? In collaboration with a team of experts in digital acoustics from Stanford University, I am bringing sound sources to my three-dimensional models. And we are analyzing how those sounds would be heard from specific listening positions. For instance, we are placing speakers outside of the tombs and realizing that their voices could be barely audible inside of the burial chambers. In the end, I'm trying to understand these tombs in the same way that archaeologists who find the remains of this very theater in a few thousand years will be able to tell that the people who once used those benches where you are sitting were able to see me, and that you were able to listen to me. Today is just one more day in the life of this building, and our lives happen to intertwine with it. I invite you to reflect on how the design of this space is affecting your experience of this event. From my perspective, I can assure you that I shall never forget having had the privilege of presenting my work in such a wonderful place. Thank you very much.
Close your eyes and picture a poet. Whose face comes to mind, and how old are they? Many people might think of the youthful face of someone like John Keats, pictured here. His youth is fetishized, even to the point of being demarcated on his headstone. But what would it have meant if we had several more decades of work from someone like Keats? Would we expect his work to stay the same or continue to change? In my work, I look at an emerging counterpoint to the male poet who dies fatefully young, and that is the older woman poet who lives into her 90s. If the younger poet of a bygone age cries, "Carpe diem," an older woman poet might instead embrace a wider scope of time. We might expect these women writers to be outdated in their writing styles, but they are some of our most innovative contributors to the world of arts and letters. My research pulls together 3 aged women poets from across the Slavic world who find themselves beyond the traditional canon of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, and who are radical practitioners of their art. Each of them lived through turbulent historical changes, Nazism, communism, the fall of the Soviet Union, and they wrote their way through these changes. Bohumila Gregorova was a Czech experimental poet. At the age of 87, she wrote a poetry collection, and here's how she opens the book. The fog coils. I elbow my way out of this fog in vain. Everywhere I look, a porridge of gray-green pearls. The poet wrote this collection as she was going blind. As she loses more of her ability to see, she begins having phantom hallucinations common to those with profound vision loss, where the brain makes an image in the absence of one. She sees and observes these warpings and discolorations in her sight as beautiful images in their own right, here as pearls, renowned for their ethereal beauty. She sees visions in her mind that come from her memory. She writes, "Today I see a thinning of radiant drops, fountains of lights, fireworks as the days go by." Writing about the process of going blind becomes the reformation of her vision rather than the loss of it. The poet moves from the visual to the visionary. Age and agency dovetail on the page for her, and her poetry pushes back against narratives of darkness and decline in old age. People might expect the elderly to write about the past since there's so much behind them to write about. But Russian poet Yelizaveta Natsakanova captures the unity of the arts and their eternity instead of solely focusing on the present moment. Natsakanova believed that there was no separation between literature, visual art, and music. And we can see her mixing of mediums at play in her handmade art books. Working in the archive, I have honed in on one of these poetic cycles called the Book of Childhood, which she worked on for nearly half a century. And I have noticed that every 10 years or so, she produced a radically revised, entirely new version of the book. There is no final version of it. From 1973 to 2018. What did the poet mean by doing this? Natsa Kanava was setting her poetry into motion and making a statement about the evolution, mutability, and eternity of poetic craft. Her art ages alongside of her. Yet another aged woman poet might hone in on the intricacies of the present moment, as in the case of Polish poet Krystyna Miłobanska. This is a poet who did not receive recognition for her work until she was in her 60s. Here is a poem that she published during that time of her emergence from obscurity. Jestem współżywa, współczynna, współzielona, współdziewna, współotwarta z oknem, współpłynna z rzeką. Cała, ale całej nigdzie nie ma. Współprzelatująca, współniebna. Pół wieku żyłam po to. There's a charged symbiosis between all living things in her work. The self coexists with her natural surroundings, and this dissipation of ego has come with the wisdom of years, with the passage of half a century. These women offer a number of ways that we may respond to our aging as human beings. Seizing upon vivid memories and producing new visions, developing one's art in service of eternity, and surrendering the self to the present. And while the cultural zeitgeist tells us to fear aging, aging is more a part of the human experience than ever before. These women show us through their work that time can be filtered through our perception of it, that time is as much emotional as it is, can be measured as much emotionally as it can empirically. And this image we have of the myth of the poet who flames out early is displaced by three poets who were long-lived, who grew and changed. Being long-lived was a blessing for them as they developed their work over time. Thank you.
The electron, a subatomic particle carrying a negative charge. All elements possess an intrinsic number of electrons, and these electrons are what define their chemical reactivity. And so, to manipulate the flow of electrons in chemical compounds is to control the ways in which they behave, the ways in which they react. The chemist is a conductor, presiding over the magnificent orchestra of electronic motion. I am such a chemist. And I study the flow of electrons within and between molecules. These are important processes. You see, I can get chemical reactions to occur by carefully managing the inventory of electrons available to a given system. Countless products that are ubiquitous in our daily lives, such as steel, textiles, plastics, fragrances, flavorings, medications, and more, are made in chemical processes that involve the flow of electrons from one species to another. Take a look at the molecules shown here on the screen. These are actually medications used to treat conditions ranging from HIV to arthritis to mental illness. What do they have in common? the trifluoromethyl group. A carbon atom surrounded by 3 fluorine atoms, this group is extremely prevalent in modern-day pharmaceuticals. But it can be a challenge to make. Fluorine is one of the hardest elements in the entire universe to remove electrons from. Its unwillingness to part ways with its electrons limits the number of ways we chemists can engage fluorine in fluorinated compounds in chemical reactivity. Take, for example, trifluoroacetate, or TFA for short. This cheap and widely available compound would be an ideal trifluoromethyl source. But to use it as such, we need to remove an electron from it, something TFA will just not do willingly. Let's imagine for a second that we could remove an electron from TFA, however. In doing so, we would destabilize the molecule, causing it to rapidly fragment into carbon dioxide and a reactive trifluoromethyl group, which we can then harness for pharmaceutical synthesis. But alas, removing electrons from TFA's vault is just too hard. And so we often derive the trifluoromethyl group from other synthetic sources that are easier to use. However, they tend to be a lot more expensive. Naturally, as a first-year graduate student, I was obsessed with achieving an unnatural flow of electrons, that which goes against the natural dogma, like water flowing up instead of down. And so I was motivated to take on this challenge, the challenge of how can we remove electrons from TFA itself? To do so would be no easy task. When it comes to TFA, you can't just walk through the front door and expect to take its electrons. No. I would need the ultimate bank robber, a compound that wants electrons so badly, it will take them from anyone, anywhere, anytime. The compound I devised to undertake this task is based upon silver, but not any type of silver you have ever seen or encountered before. An exotic form of silver, whose very existence is the product of the unnatural movement of electrons. The silver metal that we all know and love is a stable form of silver, possessing all of its electrons. The chemical symbol for silver, Ag, is derived from the Latin word argentum, and we've been dealing in its currencies and jewelries for centuries. I can actually take an electron away from silver quite easily. In doing so, I make the silver 1 ion, which is stable. Many compounds containing silver 1 are known, compounds you may have even encountered before in your daily lives. But to take a second electron away from silver, now that is unnatural. The silver 2 ion that results is a beast, with an insatiable hunger to reclaim its missing electron. A thief, an electron kleptomaniac, if you will. It will stop at nothing to reclaim its missing piece. And so it was the perfect tool for me, a tool to achieve a flow of electrons away from TFA. But to wield this tool would be no easy task, as that would mean that I would have to tame silver 2. And at the outset of my PhD, very few silver 2 compounds had ever been made before. But in this absence of knowledge, in this lack of precedence, I saw opportunity. And I seized it in the lab by devising a new synthetic strategy towards isolating large quantities of silver 2 compounds. I began by dissolving organic supporting molecules into a superacidic solution, followed by the addition of a special silver ingredient. The red color that forms is due to the generation of this compound, shown here, which I could isolate as a gorgeous red solid and hold in the palm of my gloved hand. This compound promised to usher in a new era of silver chemistry. When this compound was mixed with solutions containing TFA, a new compound was formed, one in which TFA was bonded directly to the silver 2 center. This molecule is poised for reaction, a ticking time bomb. It just needs a little push, a little energy to get things going. And what better energy than that which sustains all life on Earth? That which is illuminating this very room right now. Light. Light consists of packets of energy called photons, and Silver-2 can harness this photonic energy to rip an electron away from TFA. I'll show you. When LED lights are trained onto the molecule, the incident light is absorbed, and the molecule enters an excited state. Within this excited state, an electron is transferred from TFA to Silver-2, resulting in a stable Silver-1 ion and breaking the bond between the two. The destabilized TFA fragment then breaks, as we've seen before, yielding trifluoromethyl groups that can then be harnessed for medicinally relevant synthesis. Even better, I can reuse the silver molecule. By hooking the system up to a voltage no greater than that supplied by a AAA battery, I can turn the Silver-1 photoproduct back into Silver-2. And I can use it over and over and over again to generate tens of trifluoromethyl groups per silver molecule. And so in my reactions, silver makes up less than 1% of the overall reaction mixture by mass. Science is truly a team sport, and I would like to thank those who embarked on this journey with me from the Nocera lab, because without them, none of this would have been possible. I would also like to acknowledge generous support from the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, and the Department of Energy. But for now, I want to leave you all with the tantalizing question, one that we have only barely started to scratch the surface of in the Nocera lab. If Silver-2 can remove electrons from TFA with only the aid of visible light, are any electrons truly safe from Silver-2's grasp? Thank you.
One-fifth of people under 18 experience a mental illness each year, which can harm their quality of life, their relationships, their physical health, and their prospects for the future. 90% of these youth live in lower and middle-income countries. In high-income countries, only about a third of youth in need access mental health care, and in lower and middle-income countries, only about 1/10 of youth in need access care. Randomized controlled trials, or RCTs, are generally considered the gold standard in clinical psychology and medical research. And I found that only about 5% of youth psychotherapy RCTs have been conducted in lower and middle income countries. So overcoming this vast inequity between needs on the one hand and research and access on the other is imperative. This is a very difficult gap to overcome, however, for several reasons. First, the scale of need is huge, with hundreds of millions of youth meeting criteria for a mental illness each year. And second, personal and contextual factors influence what sort of mental health care may be most feasible and effective. Usually, we rely on highly trained experts to provide contextualized and appropriate care. However, in many parts of the world, there are few professional providers available. Even in my volunteer and clinical work in urban areas in the US, needs far exceed the services that are available. This problem is only magnified in rural areas and in many parts of lower and middle income countries. And personalized mental health care as we know it simply cannot meet the scale of the need. Bridging this gap between scale and context is what brought me to pursue a PhD in clinical psychology, where I can use skills in data, statistics, clinical care, and community-based collaboration to start to answer a very difficult question. How can we provide psychotherapies that are effective for individual youth within their personal context at a large enough scale to make a widespread difference? To give you some context, prior to my PhD, I met Tom Osborne, at the time a fellow undergraduate and an entrepreneur. And as he and I worked together to build youth psychotherapies that were both scalable and contextually appropriate, a core tenet of our work was deep involvement of and ownership by people living within the context of psychotherapy implementation, which requires a collaborative and community-based approach. So we've worked together with a large team of international collaborators, including my advisor, John Wise at Harvard, and many full and part-time staff based in Kenya, to build over the last 6 years our nonprofit Shamiri Institute. Shamiri means thrive in Kiswahili. Shamiri integrates community-based research and service, which has helped us to reach over 130,000 youth to date, and it has been central to my work at Harvard. The Shamiri intervention is a youth psychotherapy that is fit to its context, balancing pragmatism and effectiveness. Instead of lasting for 16 or more sessions, it lasts for only 4. Instead of taking place in clinics, it takes place more accessibly in schools. And instead of focusing on psychopathology, it circumvents stigma by focusing on positive concepts, growth mindset, gratitude, and values affirmations, all of which are research-backed interventions theorized to produce an upward spiral of change in beliefs and behaviors. Shamiri is delivered by lay providers, or recent high school graduates who are trained and supervised by individuals with more training in psychology, who are then supervised by a few expert clinicians available for those youth with the greatest needs. To see whether Shamiri is significantly effective, we've tested it in several RCTs. Students were randomly assigned to either the Shamiri intervention condition or to an active control condition, focused not on Shamiri, but instead on study skills. And their outcomes, including depression and anxiety, were measured over time. Let me show you just a few of our findings. In the trial shown on the screen, on the vertical axis, you can see symptom scores, where lower scores are better, and on the horizontal axis, you can see time since starting the trial, running through 7-month follow-up. We found that in both conditions, symptoms decreased, but they decreased more within the Shamiri intervention condition. And similar effects were seen across 3 other RCTs. Importantly, these effects are on aggregate. So the effects of Shamiri and its elements will differ depending on the internal and external context of each person participating. In another trial in 2021, the context had changed. At this time, schools were under a great deal of pressure following a 10-month COVID shutdown to compress 3 years of schoolwork into only 2 years. Students were so stressed that there was an epidemic of fire setting, started by highly stressed students attempting to avoid exams. And in this changed context, we were somewhat surprised to find that the study skills active control condition was actually considerably more effective than it had been previously. We think that this is because the context of highly elevated academic stress made study skills particularly relevant to reducing students' psychological distress. So building on this finding, we've designed and we've tested 3 therapy components, each targeting one of the 3 most common life problems experienced by Kenyan adolescents: social skills, study skills, and financial skills. Preliminary data show this suite of 3 life skills-focused interventions, reducing symptoms of depression and anxiety significantly more than services as usual in schools. And this is somewhat surprising to us, given that none of these life skills interventions directly target symptoms of mental illness. So, as we have multiple intervention options, how should we decide which youths in which contexts will benefit most from which interventions? This is the question that drives my current PhD research, using statistical and machine learning. And in the long term, I'm interested in personalizing community-based interventions to fit individual youth within their contexts at scale. I want to say thank you to my advisors, to my collaborators at Harvard, Shamiri, and elsewhere, to my funders, and thank you to everyone working to support those affected by mental illness around the world.
AI is now everywhere we look, and its promises are immense. Promises of revolution in crucial economic sectors like finance, education, or healthcare. Promises of a better future where interactions with AI will magnify human possibilities. But promises are only part of the story. We also need to make sure that as humans, we can fully harness the potential of AI. And that's what I study as a behavioral economist. My research leverages economic tools, such as theory and experiments, to understand our interactions with technology and help us improve our usage. What makes AI so unique as a technology is that it defies expectations in both senses of the term. On the one hand, AI is a constant source of wonder. It keeps acing difficult exams or outclassing our best experts. On the other hand, AI often makes comical mistakes and can underperform on tasks that appear trivial to us. So where does this puzzling duality come from? To understand this, it's helpful to notice that at its core, AI only does one thing. It predicts. It is trained on massive amounts of data and can learn the finer statistical patterns in this data well enough to be able to recreate human-like text or images, for example. This one thing, it does it incredibly well. As humans, we're also able to predict, but not nearly as well as AI can. However, our intelligence is not only predictive. It is, for example, perceptive, or creative, or even emotional. In other words, human and artificial intelligence are very different things. And this helps explain the duality I mentioned earlier. Because our intelligences differ so much, what makes something difficult for humans may be different for AI and vice versa. But do people realize this when interacting with AI? If we go back to our opening examples, do we notice anything? It seems that often AI is being portrayed in a human-like fashion. There's a name for this: anthropomorphism. We know it can be beneficial. Lots of research has shown that we tend to trust more the machines that are made to appear human-like. But if we portray AI as human, will we think that it will behave and perform like a human? In other words, will this lead to the projection of human traits onto AI? Together with a fellow PhD student, we studied this concept of projection and how it affects our expectations of AI, our reactions to its mistakes, and our optimization of its usage. First, expectations. We tested humans and AI on hundreds of mathematical problems of various difficulty. We then asked subjects to predict their performance. What we see is expectations for humans in orange and for AI in blue. We see that in both cases, people expect performance to decrease with the human difficulty of the problems. We then compare these expectations with reality. What we found is that expectations for humans are fairly accurate. They are, however, much less so for AI. And the reason is AI performance does not decrease with human difficulty in this context. Yet, people still believe it does. In other words, we found a projection of difficulty onto AI. And this leads people to overestimate AI on the easier problems and underestimated on the harder ones. From expectations, we then moved on to study our reactions to the mistake that AI makes. We designed an experiment where parents asked AI questions related to childcare. And this AI is overall very accurate. 95% of the time, it provided answers that were deemed to be helpful, and only around 5% did it make mistakes. To understand the experiment, picture yourself as a parent asking AI a question. For example, what brand of car seat you should buy for your baby. And then you receive this answer. Now, clearly, this is a mistake. You're likely to reduce your trust in this AI as a result, which is what we find. Now, instead, imagine that you were to receive this other answer. Now, here, would you even ask another question? And indeed, we found that the second mistake led to a much larger breach of trust and made subjects less likely to keep asking questions to the AI. Why is that? Well, the second mistake is clearly less reasonable than the first. And as humans, we tend to see the reasonableness of individual answers as a sign of overall competence. One unreasonable answer from someone makes us think that future answers coming from this person are unlikely to be any helpful. But remember, this AI is very helpful, 95% of the time. In other words, the projection of reasonableness can lead to overreactions to AI answers, and we end up shunning a tool that can still be beneficial. Finally, we studied whether projection could influence our optimization of AI usage. In a final experiment, we looked at how well people were delegating tasks to AI as we varied its framing. We compared the typical human-like framing of AI with the black box framing, where we removed any references to a human being. And we confirmed that indeed the black box framing led to a higher share of optimal usage of AI. Now, together, these studies suggest that there are pitfalls to anthropomorphism. Making our AIs human-like might still be helpful in generating that initial trust, but it may also backfire by distorting our expectations, generating overreactions, and preventing optimization. If not human-like, then how could we portray AI? Perhaps we could portray AI for what it is, a tool. Perhaps this may help us realize that, like for any other tool, it is not either game-changing or utterly terrible. What matters is how we use it. Human or tool? It is not up to me to provide the final answer. My role as a scientist is to uncover facts about our interactions with technology, to help nourish the broader debate around AI. And the stakes of the AI debate are the measure of its promises, immense. And they concern each and every one of us. Here, science alone does not have all the answers. But it may help us ask the right questions. What kind of AI future do we want? It's in our hands. Thank you.
The Inca rose to power in the 15th century. And in less than 100 years, they built the largest indigenous empire ever realized in the Americas. At its height, this empire spanned thousands of kilometers across the Andes, encompassing millions of people, animals, and resources. The Inca built an extensive road network across deserts, mountains, and jungles. They perfected terrace farming and constructed precise stone architecture. Yet remarkably, the Inca built and managed this massive empire without a conventional written script. Consider just how many text messages and emails you send every day just to manage your own life. Now imagine running an entire empire. No email, no text message, no conventional form of writing. Rather than pen and paper, the Inca relied on knotted cords like these called quipu. Now we know the Inca used quipu for a wide range of numerical purposes, like census counts and storehouse inventories. But we also have early Spanish colonial accounts that describe quipus that encoded narratives, like songs, histories, and stories. Today, much of how quipus actually functioned remains a mystery, and so my research seeks to unravel this enigma. But let's just start with a single chord. Thanks to past scholarship, we know how Inca quipus encoded numbers. Knots are arranged in groups along the chord in powers of 10, with the ones positioned furthest down the chord. Now the chord you see behind me has the number 1,636. It's represented by one knot in the thousands place, highest on the chord, 6 overhand knots in the hundreds place, 3 overhand knots in the tens place, and a special kind of knot called a long knot made here with 6 turns in the ones place, where each turn represents 1 unit. Now you may also notice an extra knot at the end of the chord here. This knot does not add to the value of the chord, but instead is there to keep it from unraveling. Now while we can confidently read numbers like these off of quipus, we don't always know what they represent. Number of people, ears of corn, Harvard's founding date? We're not always sure. And even more perplexing, some quipu chords have no knots at all. This has led researchers like myself to look for non-numerical signs in Inca quipus. Notice that the chord behind me is more than just a string with knots. It can be attached to other chords in various ways. It has color and pattern. And the body of the chord can be twisted counterclockwise or clockwise, which we call S and Z twisting, respectively. Although I'm not the first to make these observations, new methods allow me to collect higher resolution data than ever before. Rather than relying on my eyes alone, I use a Pantone system to encode colors more accurately. Instead of simply recording the external twist of the chord like we just saw, I also record the entire internal structure of each chord, which may give us a glimpse at how, and perhaps by whom, each chord was made. For my dissertation then, I've spent hundreds of hours meticulously documenting quipu attributes like these in spreadsheets. And by converting quipus to spreadsheets, I'm able to conduct large-scale analysis while simultaneously aiding in the preservation of these fragile objects. But how can these other structures, like a quipu chord's attachment knot, be used to encode data? Well, for one answer, we can turn to a set of possible Rosetta quipus. In the early 2000s, researchers identified a Spanish colonial document and a set of 6 quipus that appeared to record the same taxation event. Both the quipus and the document recorded the total amount of taxpayers and the total amount of tax owed by this community. Later, in 2018, my colleague Manny Medrano hypothesized that the 2 ways you can attach a quipu chord could be used to encode the Andean social structure of moiety, which divides communities into 2 social halves. Now, building on these insights, I wanted to see just how far I could take the Rosetta quipus. And by analyzing the quipu data alongside the document, I was able to reconstruct a detailed set of social and political hierarchies for this community. Notably, these hierarchies were absent from the Spanish document, but instead preserved in the quipus. I began asking myself, what aspects of quipus and of the past are we missing out on through our current methods? I realized we'd narrowed our perspective, focusing solely on deciphering quipus. We did not take seriously the materiality and multidimensionality that quipus had to offer us. As children, we learned that reading and writing go hand in hand. Yet for decades, we've been trying to read quipus without fully understanding how they were written. So I decided to flip the process on its head, working backwards to understand how quipus were made, who made them, and what this can tell us about their use. I thought, what better way to get inside the mind of a quipu maker than to become one myself? This has meant shifting my analysis between analyzing archaeological specimens and creating my own quipu replicas. And through this embodied practice, I've gained a better appreciation for the structures found in quipus and for the types of data they could encode. Perhaps the most interesting insight for me has been realizing that for conventional writing, any medium will do. Paper, stone, wood, you name it. These are all simply vessels for the information you wish to convey. But for quipus, the information and the medium are one and the same. But this is something you really have to experience for yourself. Perhaps you've noticed by now the bookmarks in your programs are actually quipu chords. I want you to take out these chords right now. Go ahead, take them out. I want you to feel the materiality of the chord in your hand. Feel the tactile nature of the data it encodes, and compare this to the flatness of your program. Now I want us to try adding some new information to this chord. I'd like everyone to try and tie a simple overhand knot on the topmost portion of your chord that's furthest from that end knot we talked about earlier. Go ahead, try to tie it. And notice that in doing so, in adding this new knot, this new information, you have to physically alter and physically manipulate the very structure of the material in your hands. Now, I must confess, while this talk began with the Inca, quipu technology has a much deeper history in the Andes. And even today, forms of this technology persist. Deciphering quipus then allows us to peer into the pre-Columbian past, while simultaneously having real implications for contemporary Andean communities working to preserve and revitalize quipu traditions. For now, my work, along with that of others, seeks to give voice to the histories encoded in these chords. But it's truly my hope that one day soon, the quipus will speak for themselves. Thank you.
Everybody having fun? The ancient Greek poet Sappho has been famous for a very long time. Born nearly 2,600 years ago, she is older than even the most venerable of Alex's elderly poets. She lived on the island of Lesbos, which is a small island off the coast of Greece in the Mediterranean, where she became so famous for her poetry that she's been celebrated over millennia by poets and authors from Plato to Anne Carson. In antiquity, Sappho was so renowned that she gained the nickname the 10th Muse, a promotion from mortal poet to immortal goddess of poetry that is unique in our canonical literature. In addition to being a famous ancient female poet, Sappho is also a famous ancient queer poet. Sappho wrote her love poetry to women. She was said to have had many female lovers, and her gender was a fascinating combination of masculine and feminine elements. Today, Sappho is as well known for her sexuality as she is for her poetry. Many of our modern words for female homosexuality, like sapphic and lesbian, derive from Sappho's name and biography. However, about 1,000 years ago, this absurdly famous queer poet and all of her famous queer poetry disappeared. Today, Sappho's poetry comes down to us in fragments, unearthed on bits of papyrus by archaeologists like Sergio and Mac, or identified as quotations in other texts by literary scholars like Alex and myself. Only some 600 fragments and one complete poem remain of a corpus that once filled 9 books. And this is all that's left of the most famous lyric poet of the classical world. Because of this loss of her poetry, scholars say that Sappho has a problem of what we call transmission. And this is a vocab word, it's on the test. Transmission is the word we use to describe how texts move through time with the help of scholars, scribes, printers, and readers and writers at large from one historical moment to another. And to show you an example of what I mean, let's look at an author with a good transmission history like Aristotle. Scholars have a very good idea of how Aristotle's work has moved through time and technology, from papyrus scroll to handwritten manuscript book to early printed book to modern downloadable edition. At any given point in history, we have a decent idea of how readers accessed Aristotle and where those texts came from. But in Sappho's case, we have very little idea of how her poetry was transmitted from the 7th century BC, when she was writing, to our moment today, April 8th, 2025. Now, don't panic. We do know some things. We know, for example, that Sappho's poetry was continuously read and copied for 1,200 years, not bad at all, from the 7th century BC to the 7th century AD, which is the date of our last existing papyrus. And we also know that Sappho's poetry reappears in fragments in the Renaissance, think Shakespeare, when printers compiled early editions of her remaining fragments. But between the 7th century AD and the year 1560, there is a gap in Sappho's transmission history. A lot of gaps tonight. We have very little idea of how Sappho's poetry was transmitted from the 7th century BC to the 15th century AD, from the 7th century AD to the 1560s AD, or of the processes that led to the fragmentation of her poetry. For a long time now, contemporary scholars have argued that Sappho's queerness does not survive this gap. Mapping the loss of Sappho's poetry onto historical narratives of the suppression of women's writing and homosexuality, these scholars argue that Sappho's queerness all but disappeared during this period, only to be recovered in the early 20th century when newly discovered papyri confirmed the queerness of Sappho's poetry. For most contemporary scholars, there was no queer Sappho in the Renaissance. Initially, my dissertation project focused on understanding the transmission only of Sappho's poetry across this gap. However, in the attempt to do so, I discovered that it was Sappho's queerness that not only survived this gap, but filled this gap in Sappho's transmission history for centuries. To differently understand this gap, I have proposed the study of Sappho's mythography. Mythography is what I call the study not of poems by Sappho, but of work about Sappho, in which scholars and readers over time have imagined and speculated about who the historical Sappho might have been and what she might have been like. And to give you an example of one of these mythographic texts, let's look at this commentary by the Italian scholar Angelo Poliziano, who was writing in the 1480s, right in the middle of this gap that I was discussing earlier. In this text, Poliziano instructs readers on how to interpret a reference to Sappho in another book. He explains that a reader should compare Sappho to the ancient philosopher Socrates. He writes, Maximus of Tyre said that Sappho's way of loving was the same as Socrates. Just as she loved women, so did he love men. It's very, very gay. Not only does Poliziano explicitly name Sappho's queerness at a time when scholars say people did not do this, he backs himself up with 3 genuine fragments of Sappho's actual poetry, more than a century before scholars acknowledged that these poems were even available to be read. In this mythographic text, Sappho's mythology and her texts are intertwined at every level, with each shaping the transmission of the other, and with Sappho's queerness as a fundamental element of both. When we consider mythography as a form of transmission, we dramatically increase the number of texts that we have to study. While scholars have been focusing mostly on the transmission only of Sappho's poems, we have very little to examine. However, when we add the study of Sappho's mythography, suddenly we have more text than we know what to do with. And in all seriousness, if any of you read Latin or Greek, I desperately need help translating, transcribing, and transmitting these works. My study of Sappho's mythography has allowed me to press our knowledge of this gap in Sappho's transmission back in time, step by step, text by text. When we add these mythographic texts to the timeline I presented earlier, we see that the narrative of Sappho's transmission is not one of lost and found, but rather one of continuous imagination and engagement with her poetry and mythography over millennia. In my framework, this gap in Sappho's transmission history melts away. It is my hope that this work on Sappho's transmission will not only aid scholars in understanding how Sappho was historically read and interpreted, but also in the study of the transmission of marginalized communities with broken textual histories in general. Sappho is no lost poet, no victim of history unable to survive in the face of unimaginable oppression. Rather, she has been continually present in poems and plays, in sculptures and statues, and in the minds of the readers who have imagined her again and again and again, regardless of the presence or absence of her poetry. Finally, it is my hope that this work will provide not only narratives of queer suppression, but queer survival. Sappho did not survive in spite of her queerness, but in fact because of a queerness that was the continual invitation to create and understand, an enduring effort to imagine the future by imagining the past. Thank you.
Wow. Just wow. I hate this, having to follow them. You were amazing. You were extraordinary. And you know what you did, Harvard Horizon scholars. Not least, you made us all feel super clever because we understood every word of your amazing original research, and we're so inspired. We want to talk about it all night. So kudos to you, congratulations. And you really do, you embody the impact that generations of Harvard Griffin GSAS graduates have had across disciplines all over the world for more than 150 years. So let's hear it for you. But, yes. You're amazing. And we're going to celebrate you one more time. But before we do that, I want to recognize just a few of the people who've made this program such a success. Huge thanks to Xiaoli Meng and Hisa Kuriyama, who first proposed the idea. Huge thanks to the generous Harvard Griffin GSAS alumni whose funding makes this program possible. And huge thanks to the faculty fellows for their outstanding guidance and mentorship of this year's scholars, and especially big call out to Laura Fram, who was instrumental in designing the program from the very beginning. So thank you. And so many thanks to Harvard Griffin GSAS and Derek Box Center staff, past and present, without whom none of this would happen. So thank you. And big shout out to Noelle Bisson from Harvard Griffin GSAS and Jordan Kaufman of the Box Center, whose work with the Horizons Scholars has enabled them to walk a kind of tightrope. You did justice both to the complexity and the originality of your research, and you made it legible and so exciting for all of us. So big thanks to Noelle and Jordan above all. And now, I'd like to ask our amazing scholars to come back onto the stage so that we can celebrate you one more time. So calling out for Andrew. Sergio, Alex, Brandon, Catherine, Raphael, McKinley, and Catherine. And finally, please join us and the Harvard Horizons 2025 scholars in the transept for a reception. Thank you.